The void had always known silence, but even silence carried dread, and dread had a name older than the first pulse of light. The Star Devourer, a being so vast that entire galaxies shivered at the mere resonance of its approach, a godlike predator whose hunger had ended civilizations before they even glimpsed the concept of survival, whose core pulsed with molten fury, each heartbeat sending ripples of annihilation through the fabric of space itself. And yet on this day, in a forgotten corner of the spiral galaxy, the universe paused, as if aware that something fragile, tiny, and inconceivably bold had entered its domain. A human child, just 6 years old, adrift in a crippled interstellar vessel whose engines had long since died and whose shields flickered impotently against the cold, infinite dark. The ship, battered from meteoric impacts and radiation storms, floated like a driftwood fragment in an ocean of void, its hull cracked, warning lights blinking erratically, alarms screaming a chorus of impending doom. And within, the child stirred from cryosleep, eyes blinking open at the faint glow of distant stars, unaware that she was seconds from obliteration. Her tiny body strapped into a capsule designed to preserve life, but incapable of withstanding a single heartbeat of the Devourer's immense gravitational pull. The emergency life support already down to 7 minutes of oxygen, every system failing, every warning light a whispered countdown to oblivion. And yet, she did not scream. She did not cry. She did not even fully comprehend the magnitude of what surrounded her, for she had never seen a galaxy as it truly was, never realized that planets themselves could shatter, never understood that stars were sustenance to entities older than thought itself. And outside, the darkness stirred with anticipation, a presence invisible yet incomprehensibly immense, approaching with the inevitability of a storm that does not ask permission, whose gravity twisted light, whose corona of fire bent the paths of nearby stars, sending shock waves through planetary systems. And the Devourer's awareness, something far beyond comprehension, a consciousness without mercy or hesitation, focused on the impossible sight of a human child floating alone, unarmed, unprotected, and yet alive. A spark in the void, fragile yet unafraid, moving exactly as it should not. And for the first time in eons, a ripple of hesitation passed through the predator, as if it recognized an anomaly in the cosmic order, a presence that did not belong, a life form so insignificant and yet radiating something it had not felt in billions of years, intent without threat, presence without calculation, innocence without instinct to dominate. And the universe itself seemed to respond to this collision of scales, stars dimming slightly as if to witness the impossible, black holes quieting their ravenous pull, cosmic radiation bending differently, as if the fabric of existence recoiled in recognition of something that should not. And the child, tiny and trembling, floated toward the observation window of her capsule, her small hands brushing against the translucent barrier, her fingers splayed across the surface as if reaching not for safety but for acknowledgement. A human gesture, meaningless to most of creation, yet monumental to the entity observing. And the Devourer, whose hunger had ended species in a blink, whose movements had rewritten the architecture of entire star systems, contracted, coils of plasma and superheated matter rippling as it paused, every particle in its being vibrating with confusion, for nothing in its memory had ever approached it without fear, aggression, or cunning. And yet here was a life form that carried none of those, whose heart beat rapidly, whose lungs struggled against mechanical life support, whose mind understood nothing of gravity wells, energy fields, or the consequences of cosmic proximity. And yet, in that uncomprehending gaze, the Devourer perceived something profound, the willingness of life to persist without domination, the bravery of existence in the face of annihilation, and the audacity of innocence to meet death unflinching. And the child leaned closer, her tiny face pressed against the glass of her pod, tears floating weightless, her breaths fogging the surface in minute swirls. And though she did not know it, she offered a gesture older than the stars, a gesture that transcended species, power, and survival, a kiss through a barrier, pure and uncalculated, born of instinct and wonder rather than bravery or defiance. And the devourer recoiled slightly, not in pain, but in recognition, its core quivering as memories older than light surged, recollections of a time when it had existed not solely to consume, when galaxies thrived without fear of it, when life blossomed alongside it rather than beneath it. And the ripple of remembrance swept through its massive form, folding its coils inward, forming a protective arc around the vessel, energy shimmering around it in a gravitational cocoon, a shield woven from instinct and ancient memory rather than force. And the child, sensing nothing but warmth in her tiny chest, relaxed slightly, her panic muted by the unknowable calm that radiated from the entity, while around them, distant observers, alien civilizations, rogue drones, and drifting cosmic predators, halted, frozen in awe and terror, understanding that the devourer, the cosmic predator that ended eons of life, was performing an act no one could have anticipated: protection, restraint, guardianship. And in the silence of the void, punctuated only by the faint hum of failing machinery, the devourer moved, not toward destruction, but toward survival, spiraling away from its habitual course of annihilation, warping space-time as it carried the pod, gently, impossibly, weaving gravitational eddies around it, while human vessels, scattered across the sector, registered anomalies too late, instruments screaming in futility as operators stared at incomprehensible readings, their eyes wide, their brains refusing to correlate what was happening. And still, the child remained unaware, her tiny hands clasping her knees, her eyes wide with confusion, her mind incapable of understanding that she had just halted the appetite of a cosmic god with nothing but presence and trust. And the devourer's pulse, a rhythm that could incinerate worlds, softened slightly, flowing around the pod, a dance of energy and restraint, shaping currents of plasma and fire not to harm, but to cradle, to shield, to remember. And all across the void, distant observers, civilizations that had feared its passage, entities that had plotted its demise, and even rogue stars on collision courses, felt an instinctive reverence, a sudden understanding of a law older than time itself. Do not harm the young of humans, do not challenge the fragile spark that persists against the impossible, for they carry within them a force no hunger, no weapon, no predator can withstand. And the devourer, drifting, twisting, and coiling in the black between galaxies, carrying the pod in an impossible trajectory, shaping gravitational tides to its will, while human vessels, scattered across the sector, registered anomalies too late, instruments screaming in futility as operators stared at incomprehensible readings, their eyes wide, their brains refusing to correlate what was happening. And still, the child remained unaware, her tiny hands clasping her knees, her eyes wide with confusion, her mind incapable of understanding that she had just halted the appetite of a cosmic god with nothing but presence and trust. And the devourer's pulse, a rhythm that could incinerate worlds, softened slightly, flowing around the pod, a dance of energy and restraint, shaping currents of plasma and fire not to harm, but to cradle, to shield, to remember. And all across the void, distant observers, civilizations that had feared its passage, entities that had plotted its demise, and even rogue stars on collision courses, felt an instinctive reverence, a sudden understanding of a law older than time itself. Do not harm the young of humans, do not challenge the fragile spark that persists against the impossible, for they carry within them a force no hunger, no weapon, no predator can withstand. And the devourer, drifting, twisting, and coiling in the black between galaxies, carrying the pod in an impossible trajectory, shaping gravitational tides to its will, while human vessels, scattered across the sector, registered anomalies too late, instruments screaming in futility as operators stared at incomprehensible readings, their eyes wide, their brains refusing to correlate what was happening. And still, the child remained unaware, her tiny hands clasping her knees, her eyes wide with confusion, her mind incapable of understanding that she had just halted the appetite of a cosmic god with nothing but presence and trust. And the devourer's pulse, a rhythm that could incinerate worlds, softened slightly, flowing around the pod, a dance of energy and restraint, shaping currents of plasma and fire, not to harm, but to cradle, to shield, to remember. And all across the void, distant observers, the universe had no room for mercy. And yet, in the seconds that stretched like centuries, the devourer moved with deliberate precision, its coils of plasma and fire shaping an impossible path through collapsing star systems and gravitational maelstroms, every pulse of its core sending tremors through planets, asteroids, and drifting space debris. And the human child, suspended in her pod, felt only the gentle rocking of what should have been annihilation, but was instead a cradle, her small fingers brushing against the glass, tracing the faintly glowing edges of warning lights that had become meaningless in the face of incomprehensible scale. While outside, cosmic predators, beings as old as light itself, remnants of civilizations the devourer had already devoured, watched from the shadows of neutron stars and the tails of comets, paralyzed by instinct. For they had learned long ago that interference with the devourer meant certain death. And yet, something had shifted in the cold mechanics of the void, a subtle tremor of law that no equation or calculation could predict. For here floated a life form so fragile, so fleeting, that even annihilation seemed to hesitate. And the child's pod, battered and crackling with failing energy, drifted closer to the core of the devourer, where gravity folded space in impossible loops, where light bent and melted like wax in fire, and the devourer's molten eye, or what passed for its perception, a whirlpool of fire, plasma, and something older than thought, followed her movements with an intensity that would have obliterated any other being. But she did not scream. She did not flail. She simply looked, her wide eyes reflecting the inferno that should have ended her existence. And in that gaze, the devourer felt a contradiction so profound it destabilized its ancient instincts. Terror, hunger, instinct, and survival coalesced around her small, trembling form, yet none of it applied to her. None of it demanded annihilation. And for the first time, it experienced something it could not categorize: curiosity that did not end in death, an anomaly of existence that challenged billions of years of instinct and habit. And the child, aware only of movement, of vibrations through the glass of her pod, leaned forward slightly, her tiny body suspended between consciousness and oblivion. And for a moment, the void itself seemed to hold its breath. For every nearby system, every drifting comet, every fragile life form orbiting distant stars sensed the shift, the subtle change in the balance of terror and awe. And the devourer pulsed, its fire wrapping around the pod in spirals of protection, shielding her from radiation flares that would have incinerated any other vessel, from collapsing debris fields that shredded starships with ease, from gravitational spikes that tore matter apart like paper. And the child, her tiny fingers pressing against the glass as if communicating a secret she did not understand, a secret that transcended language, species, and the cold mathematics of survival, created a resonance the devourer had not felt since the birth of the first stars. Recognition, the flicker of memory buried in plasma and fire, of a time before hunger dominated, before life was merely fuel, before annihilation was instinct. And somewhere in the molten depths of its consciousness, a question formed, so alien, so impossible, that it fractured the devourer's focus on consumption. Why is she not afraid? Why does she not flee? Why does she not scream or fight or perish? And as these thoughts radiated, the universe responded, sending small shock waves through the fabric of spacetime, small enough to go unnoticed by most, but for drifting civilizations and sentient observers in isolated pockets, the anomaly was visible, detectable, impossible. A child causing a god to pause in the void. A being whose tendrils could destroy entire star systems, now circling a vessel no larger than a human crib. And the child, in a gesture that was instinctive and pure, placed her tiny hand on the glass over the glowing energy of the devourer's protective coils, feeling heat without pain, vibration without pressure, and for the first time, the devourer recoiled slightly, not in anger, not in hunger, not in instinct to destroy, but in recognition of a presence that carried no threat, no hunger, no cunning, a being whose only intent was existence, whose only weapon was life itself, and the coils tightened subtly, shifting and reshaping to absorb minor gravitational anomalies, deflect radiation bursts, redirect comet fragments. And yet, despite all the protective measures, the child's oxygen was failing, the alarms inside the pod screaming a frantic countdown, and the devourer sensed the imminent loss, the fragility of human life compressed into mere minutes. And it pulsed, sending ripples of plasma and gravitational waves in a pattern so precise that even nearby stars bent light around it in response, creating a corridor of safety across hundreds of thousands of kilometers. And the child, sensing warmth, sensing protection, sensing presence, opened her mouth slightly, her lips parting as if to offer a word of comfort. And though sound could not traverse the void, the gesture reached the devourer with clarity more perfect than speech, more precise than any data. And in that contact, a fragment of memory flared. The devourer had once existed before hunger, had once observed life for wonder, had once felt the absurdity of existence not as fuel, but as beauty. And the shock of recollection sent energy rippling across its coils, creating mini shockwaves that threatened to destabilize the very fabric of the child's pod. Yet the devourer adjusted, a mind-boggling act of precision, reshaping plasma streams, energy flows, and gravitational curvature to maintain perfect equilibrium, while observers across the void watched in awe, in terror, and in disbelief, for the impossible was unfolding. A child, utterly powerless, utterly human, had commanded the attention, restraint, and protective instinct of a being whose mere appetite had ended entire civilizations. And the devourer, sensing the fragility, the innocence, the audacity of her existence, began to shift course, moving through collapsing debris, through gravitational storms, through pockets of space where time stretched and bent unnaturally, carrying the pod with terrifying speed, a speed unimaginable for any human understanding, warping space in corridors of safety, weaving between stars with precision that no map or calculation could define. And the child, eyes wide, hands clutching her knees, had no comprehension of the cosmic ballet she had initiated, no understanding that every pulse of the devourer's fire, every contraction of its molten form, every shift in gravitational curvature was entirely in response to her, that the fragile spark of human life had become a lodestar for a godlike predator. And as the minutes ticked down, as the alarms screamed louder inside her failing capsule, the devourer's eye, or vortex, focused with something approaching wonder, something approaching reverence, something it had not known since the creation of light itself. And in that awareness, the void seemed to pulse with a new law, a law older than gravity, older than causality. Do not harm the young of humans. They possess a force no destruction can withstand, a presence no hunger can erase, a spark no predator can extinguish. And the child, suspended between life and oblivion, floated as if in a dream, unaware of the scale, unaware of the peril, that she had turned a cosmic predator into a guardian, had rewritten instinct itself, had created a corridor of protection that no civilization, no weapon, no intelligence could have achieved. and the devourer, carrying her with terrifying speed through the void, continued to pulse, coiling and shifting, reshaping the currents of plasma and fire around her, weaving a corridor of light and heat that bent reality itself, shielding her from gravitational anomalies, from collapsing comets, from radiation storms, from the deadly consequences of proximity to a god. While the universe watched silently, the void itself acknowledging that what had occurred was not destruction, not survival by cunning, not survival by force, but survival by the audacity of life, by the courage of innocence, by the persistence of the smallest, most fragile spark against the incomprehensible. And somewhere in the molten depths of the devourer's consciousness, a recoil, compressed, expanded, reshaped, remembered, and protected, not because it had to, not because instinct demanded, not because hunger required, but because the universe itself had shifted, had witnessed an impossible event, had learned a new law that would ripple across time and space. For a child had survived, not by weapons, not by skill, not by calculation, but by being exactly what she was: small, fragile, human, and utterly alive. And as the devourer surged through the collapsing remnants of dying systems, weaving between stellar debris and gravitational turbulence with terrifying grace, it became clear that the laws of hunger, terror, and annihilation were no longer absolute, that the spark of human life carried a power older than light. And in the infinite darkness, amidst collapsing stars and bending galaxies, the first act of guardianship had begun, and story of life commanding the attention of death, of innocence taming a predator, and of humanity reminding a god of what it had long forgotten. The void, once empty, now felt alive, vibrating with a dread so profound it could be measured in light years, and the devourer, immense, godlike, and ancient beyond comprehension, pulsed with every heartbeat that had ever ended civilizations, yet now each pulse was a calculation of preservation rather than annihilation, a rhythm warped around the delicate human life cradled in her pod, and the child, tiny, trembling, half-conscious, with oxygen near zero and alarms screaming a frantic symphony inside the failing capsule, drifted like a leaf in a hurricane, unaware of the horror surrounding her, unaware of the countless stars that could crush her pod, unaware that every ounce of her existence was a paradox against the devourer's instinct. And outside, the galaxy itself seemed to fracture in response, stellar winds whipping through collapsing systems, asteroids torn from orbit, comets breaking apart in streams of molten ice and rock. And yet, the devourer moved through this chaos with terrifying precision, each coil of molten plasma wrapping around the pod like a living shield, energy fields twisting and bending space around her, diverting deadly radiation flares, deflecting fragments the size of cities, manipulating gravity so that every dangerous force in its path flowed harmlessly past the tiny vessel. And the child, through half-lidded eyes, saw nothing but molten fire and distant points of light bending like liquid, a vision of terror so immense that any mind should have shattered. And yet she felt a faint warmth, a pulse in the void, as if the darkness itself had a heartbeat. And somewhere in that pulse, a consciousness older than stars, hungering longer than galaxies had existed, hesitated. The devourer's molten eye, or vortex of perception, focused on the impossibly small life with something approaching awe, curiosity, and a dread unlike any it had known. For no being had ever entered its path without fear, without cunning, without the instinct to dominate. And yet here was a human child, utterly defenseless, utterly fragile, utterly alive. And the devourer recoiled, contracted, expanded, reshaping entire plasma currents, gravitational folds, and energy flows to maintain the pod's fragile integrity, every decision a calculation across trillions of particles, every movement risking catastrophic collapse, while cosmic predators, ancient and unseen, observed from distant stars, black holes, and drifting planetary remnants, unable to comprehend how a human spark could alter the flow of forces that had never failed. And the child, sensing nothing but warmth and vibration through the capsule, reached out instinctively, tiny fingers brushing against the glass, pressing her forehead gently to the dome in a gesture so human, so delicate, so absurdly fragile against the vastness of annihilation, that the devourer recoiled as if struck, memories older than time itself surging through molten plasma and energy fields, visions of a time when it had existed for wonder, for beauty, for connection, before existence had been defined by consumption and hunger, and the shockwave of recognition tore through its molten coils, fracturing plasma streams, bending gravitational currents, while the child, unaware of the magnitude of her gesture, closed her eyes, letting her presence speak where words could not. And the devourer's coils, massive as small planets, shifted around her, forming a protective spiral that moved as one with her tiny pod, absorbing the violent energy of collapsing comets, redirecting plasma storms, and shielding her from gravitational turbulence that would have annihilated entire civilizations. Yet even as she floated in this impossible sanctuary, oxygen was nearly depleted, alarms screaming, machinery failing, and the devourer felt a sensation foreign, terrifying, urgent. The fragility of life, the imminence of death, and the responsibility of preservation. And in response, it surged forward, faster than any being had ever moved, warping space-time in its colossal passage, bending reality around the pod, while stars flickered and quaked under the force of its movement, cosmic radiation bending around it like water around a stone, and the child, sensing nothing but gentle motion, relaxed slightly, her small chest rising and falling in erratic breaths, unaware that she had become the axis upon which a god had turned, that her presence alone had forced the devourer to abandon billions of years of instinct. And as they moved, the devourer's perception sharpened, focusing on every threat, every anomaly, every shard of collapsing debris. Yet it did not falter, for it had learned, impossibly, that the smallest spark of life carried a force older than hunger, a presence older than death, and the child, in a gesture of innocent trust, pressed her lips to the glass, a silent kiss across a void where sound could not travel, and in that contact, the devourer felt an explosion of memory and instinct, visions of life existing for wonder, for beauty, for connection, before existence had been defined by consumption and hunger, and the shockwave of recognition tore through its molten coils, fracturing plasma streams, bending gravitational currents, while the child, unaware of the magnitude of her gesture, closed her eyes, letting her presence speak where words could not. And the devourer's coils, massive as small planets, shifted around her, forming a protective spiral that moved as one with her tiny pod, absorbing the violent energy of collapsing comets, redirecting plasma storms, and shielding her from gravitational turbulence that would have annihilated entire civilizations. Yet even as she floated in this impossible sanctuary, oxygen was nearly depleted, alarms screaming, machinery failing, and the devourer felt a sensation foreign, terrifying, urgent. The fragility of life, the imminence of death, and the responsibility of preservation. And in response, it surged forward, faster than any being had ever moved, warping space-time in its colossal passage, bending reality around the pod, while stars flickered and quaked under the force of its movement, cosmic radiation bending around it like water around a stone, and the child, sensing nothing but gentle motion, relaxed slightly, her small chest rising and falling in erratic breaths, unaware that she had become the axis upon which a god had turned, that her presence alone had forced the devourer to abandon billions of years of instinct. And as they moved, the devourer's perception sharpened, focusing on every threat, every anomaly, every shard of collapsing debris, yet it did not falter, for it had learned, impossibly, that the smallest spark of life carried a force older than hunger, a presence older than death, and the child, in a gesture of innocent trust, pressed her lips to the glass, a silent kiss across a void where sound could not travel, and in that contact, the devourer felt an explosion of memory and instinct, visions of life existing for wonder, for beauty, for connection, before existence had been defined by consumption and hunger, and the shockwave of recognition tore through its molten coils, fracturing plasma streams, bending gravitational currents, while the child, unaware of the magnitude of her gesture, closed her eyes, letting her presence speak where words could not. And the devourer's coils, massive as small planets, shifted around her, forming a protective spiral that moved as one with her tiny pod, absorbing the violent energy of collapsing comets, redirecting plasma storms, and shielding her from gravitational turbulence that would have annihilated entire civilizations. Yet even as she floated in this impossible sanctuary, oxygen was nearly depleted, alarms screaming, machinery failing, and the devourer felt a sensation foreign, terrifying, urgent. The fragility of life, the imminence of death, and the responsibility of preservation. And in response, it surged forward, faster than any being had ever moved, warping space-time in its colossal passage, bending reality around the pod, while stars flickered and quaked under the force of its movement, cosmic radiation bending around it like water around a stone, and the child, sensing nothing but gentle motion, relaxed slightly, her small chest rising and falling in erratic breaths, unaware that she had become the axis upon which a god had turned, that her presence alone had forced the devourer to abandon billions of years of instinct. And as they moved, the devourer's perception sharpened, focusing on every threat, every anomaly, every shard of collapsing debris. Yet it did not falter, for it had learned, impossibly, that the smallest spark of life carried a force older than hunger, a presence older than death, and the child, in a gesture of innocent trust, pressed her lips to the glass, a silent kiss across a void where sound could not travel, and in that contact, the devourer felt an explosion of memory and instinct, visions of life existing for wonder, for beauty, for connection, before existence had been defined by consumption and hunger, and the shockwave of recognition. The void trembled with anticipation, the last echoes of collapsing star systems reverberating across the infinite darkness as the devourer, god of annihilation, surged forward with a speed no thought, no calculation, no machine could ever match, carrying the fragile human pod cradled in coils of molten plasma and energy fields that bent light, gravity, and time itself, and the child, tiny, trembling, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion, seemed almost unaware of the colossal scale of danger surrounding her, her breaths shallow, oxygen nearly gone, machinery screaming futile alarms, and the devourer, sensing the imminence of death, contracted its immense form, reshaping currents of plasma, redirecting collapsing planetary fragments, diverting radiation flares, weaving through the collapsing remnants of a dying star cluster with a precision that defied comprehension, every motion a calculated act of guardianship against forces capable of annihilating entire galaxies, while distant observers, drifting alien explorers, sentient satellites, and ancient cosmic predators watched in frozen awe and terror, instruments unable to process the impossible, as a human child alone had bent the instincts of a being whose mere presence had ended eons of life, and as the devourer twisted and coiled, sending pulses of energy that rippled through the void and warped the trajectories of collapsing asteroids and dying suns, the child, sensing warmth and stability, slowly opened her eyes, pressing her tiny hands against the glass of her pod, unaware that her touch, her presence, her audacity had shifted the balance of survival and destruction across entire star systems, while the devourer, feeling the urgency of her dwindling life support, pulsed violently, a shockwave of molten plasma and gravitational distortion that cracked the paths of distant stars, yet none of it reached her. Her pod cradled perfectly in a corridor of safety, shaped by instinct, memory, and something older than light itself. And the child, in a gesture of instinctive trust, leaned forward and pressed her lips against the pod's dome, a silent kiss sent not as a command, but as a presence, as a signal of life against annihilation. And in that instant, the devourer's core, vortex of molten fire and energy older than galaxies, shuddered with recognition, memories surfacing in violent, chaotic waves, eons of destruction, billions of years of consumption, civilizations snuffed out in a heartbeat, and suddenly, a recollection of something it had not known since the birth of the first stars, a time when it had observed life not to devour, but to witness, when existence had value beyond fuel, when warmth, beauty, and connection had mattered. And that realization struck with the force of a supernova, destabilizing its instincts, sending ripples through coils of molten plasma that reshaped space-time around the pod, diverting comets, bending gravitational waves, dissipating radiation flares, and shielding the child as if she were a treasure the universe itself had demanded it protect. And in response, the void itself seemed to pulse, the very fabric of existence acknowledging a new law, silent yet absolute, spreading across systems, across sentient observers, across instinct-driven predators, a law older than light in causality. Do not harm the young of humans. They carry a force no predator can comprehend, a spark older than destruction, a presence capable of bending instinct and memory alike, a life that commands attention without threat, without cunning, without hunger, and even the oldest, most godlike beings must yield to it. And as this law propagated, the devourer surged upward, faster than any known speed, twisting and coiling through collapsing stars, weaving between molten debris and gravitational anomalies, reshaping plasma currents and energy flows with terrifying grace, while the child, sensing only gentle rocking, warmth, and vibration, floated in her pod, fragile yet alive, her tiny body now the axis upon which instinct, memory, and ancient power pivoted, and alarms inside the capsule screamed as oxygen dwindled towards zero, yet she remained untouched, because the devourer had abandoned all instinct of consumption, had abandoned every law of annihilation, every habit of destruction, and now existed solely as guardian, a colossal, godlike being moved entirely by protection. And the child, sensing her fleeting awareness of the void, lifted a tiny hand, pressed it against the dome, feeling a pulse through the glass, a vibration that carried reassurance, warmth, and presence. And the devourer responded, twisting its coils around her, forming a cocoon of molten plasma and warped gravity, reshaping every potential threat into harmless arcs around the pod, while galaxies bent light, nebulae twisted in reverent arcs, and distant observers, both sentient and instinctive, realized in awe that a human child had commanded a cosmic predator, that innocence had tamed annihilation, and that even the oldest law, the law of consumption, of hunger, of survival, had been rewritten. And then, as the pod's oxygen reached its critical limit, the child's body went limp, drifting as if surrendering to death, and the devourer, sensing the collapse of life it had been charged to protect, pulsed with unimaginable force, sending shockwaves that bent stars, ruptured collapsing comets, and shifted gravitational currents across entire systems. Yet the pod remained unbroken, cradled, shielded, alive. And in that instant, the devourer's eye, or molten vortex, focused fully, understanding for the first time in eons that this fragile life, this tiny human spark, had achieved something no galaxy, no civilization, no predator could ever claim. It had commanded attention, reshaped instinct, and rewritten the laws of survival simply by being, simply by existing. And the child, carried gently in the coils, slowly stirred, her tiny chest rising, her tiny fingers curling, unaware of the cosmic upheaval she had caused, while the devourer, now fully guardian, twisted upward through the void with terrifying speed, passing collapsing stars and streams of molten debris, bending light and gravity to ensure her survival, until finally it released her toward a habitable system, a trajectory perfect in every measure, ensuring she would reach safety while it vanished back into the void. And human vessels, scattered across the sector, detected the anomalies too late, alarms screaming, instruments failing, operators frozen in disbelief as reports streamed in of gravitational anomalies, collapsing stars surviving impossible proximity, energy pulses unaccounted for. Yet on a small outpost, the pod landed gently, deposited on the surface of a habitable world, perfectly intact, the child alive, unaware, her tiny body shaking, but breathing, and she would never remember the precise events, never understand the scale, yet her survival would ripple across history, myth, and instinct, for from that day onward, cosmic predators paused in the presence of humans, instinct-driven beings across galaxies recoiled, and the devourer, god of annihilation, returned to the dark, no longer hunter, no longer consumer, only guardian, its law etched into the currents of plasma, into gravitational waves, into the very memory of the void. Do not harm the young of humans. They are untouchable. They are unassailable. They bend annihilation itself with presence alone. And somewhere in the infinite darkness, amidst collapsing stars and twisted nebulae, the child slept, tiny, fragile, human, and the universe remembered, a law older than light, older than death, older than hunger itself, written across the cosmos, carried silently by instinct, memory, and awe, because a child had stared into the maw of annihilation and survived.